in many ways, shame is like the furthest end of survival. And so we see ourselves as the problem, and the organism wires that way. Emotion integration is the ability to metabolize these emotions. And in order to metabolize them, you have to be present with them. And so that's why the body is the conduit and is the primary focus to processing the past, because the body is the only thing that can always be present.
Welcome to the Vitalist Podcast, where healing meets wonder. This is your space to gain transformative knowledge, deepen your mind-body connection, and awaken your human spirit. If you're ready to connect with your innate potential, embrace life's challenges, and expand what you believe is possible, this is the place. Get ready to slow down, be moved, and live like a true vitalist.
Wes Kress is a practitioner, speaker, and founder of Breakthrough Performance and Rehab, where he integrates genomics, functional medicine, Eastern wisdom, and somatic healing. Do you mind sharing a little bit of your story? Because your background is one where you experience quite significant health challenges. Maybe some would label it hitting a rock bottom in some aspects. But I would love for people just to get a picture of what you experienced, and then what was the pivot point for you to redefine your relationship to those symptoms and really step into this healing on a whole new level.
For one, I grew up in a cult religion. And when you grow up in a cult religion, essentially your conditioning and your social programming starts the beginning of your nervous system development in a very contracted state. So many ways we're social creatures trying to survive from the sort of conditioned state. And when you are defined in such a small box, your nervous system starts to perceive everything as a threat that's not within that small box. So that was like part of the early conditioning and trauma and psychological development that you don't know. And that's the nature of healing to begin with. And I had sexual trauma from age 4 to 13 that also created a huge amount of shift in my nervous system. And a lot of this you don't know because everything's a brand new experience when you're born into the world. So I think it was about age 7 where I was essentially sitting underneath a bridge, and I had attempted to run away. And that was like the first attempt to sort of like try to understand like what was happening. And I recognized that what was happening wasn't healthy. And I certainly experienced a lot of separation and disconnection. So I realized at that point that I probably didn't have the resources to be able to actually run away. And so I went back and essentially, tried to survive within the dynamics, but I knew something had shifted. And what that shift was something that was very complex, and I was unable to understand exactly what that was. I just knew things were extremely not right. And that was through a lot of symptoms and signs that I was starting to experience. I had skin issues, started having sickness all the time. A lot of these things were the nervous system communicating to me that I wasn't in a healthy environment, in a healthy situation. And at the time, I thought my body was betraying me. And really, my body was being the one that was speaking the truth. And so, that betrayal was part of essentially transference. And we do that, right? A lot of people think that the nature of the body is the problem, and it's actually just the representation of the truth. The body can't lie, but the mind can. And that's inherently wired into us, right? As social creatures, and evolutionary wise, like it's more important to stay within a tribe, even if it's unhealthy, if it meant the survival of your life through resources and so forth. So I think there was nothing inherently wrong with how things were unfolding. And the question was just like, how do you unwind from that? And so that age 7 progressively got worse. Sickness and disease progressed to the point where by the time I was 19, I had 70 different signs and symptoms and 4 autoimmune diseases, and sort of led to that point where you're talking about, which is this rock bottom. At 7, I started studying everything to try to get well.
How do you see these experiences creating patterns in the mind or patterns in the body, and how do they continue to live there?
Yeah, so the patterns are essentially like feedback loops. They're essentially sort of create sort of vicious cycles. This is part of what makes reality and then healing kind of difficult. They live there because they sort of are wired to sort of absorb the environment which it survived in. And this is why it's like almost counterintuitive to sort of like navigate the nature of the healing path, and is because vicious cycles and virtuous cycles are sort of two different paradigms. And what we're trying to do is shift from vicious cycles, which most people can kind of say they experience to some degree or another, where they're like trying to create change and the change is not working. And then they try even harder and they seem to like be digging in almost like you're going into quicksand or a black hole, so to speak. And so when trauma occurs as an organism, we don't recognize our individuated self, especially when it happens very early on. And so it automatically sees itself as the problem. That's why emotional shame is like the furthest from the truth and the most impactful, but it was meant there to keep us in the ability to survive within a dynamic that wasn't nurturing, that wasn't healthy. And so in many ways, shame is like the furthest end of survival. And so we see ourselves as the problem, and the organism wires that way. And shame, blame, and guilt and fear of touching on those sort of really unpleasant and painful emotions are a large way of how the nervous system navigate. And so we absorb those sides of the equation and we see ourselves as the problem. And so then the mind sort of interprets it that way and then creates the same sort of like commentary in order to keep us alive, right? Which would make sense because if you're still alive, it must have worked. Yet it is not necessarily the same things that help us survive isn't what help us heal. In order to change, the fascinating thing is you have to do less, not more. At the layer of the mind is that we sort of have to like approach it from a standpoint of witnessing what is happening. And through the witnessing, it's almost like, bringing an observer into a physics experiment. The observer changes the experiment and all of the sort of results of that experiment, but it's really not doing anything. But actually, the powerful action is actually not doing anything. And when I say not doing anything, I mean in the essence of like active presence and attunement, not necessarily in unconsciousness. So I think there's a key distinction there. Most of us like are unconscious to a lot of these aspects, and the mind takes us into those unconscious patterns. And so those unconscious patterns actually lead us further down these loops that we're talking about into behaviors that further enforce the very nature of destruction that was actually imprinted on us from a standpoint of trauma or unhealthy behaviors of conditioning that we're trying to unwind.
I feel like people, when they observe, they want to fix. I think it's very common. So what do you say to those people? Like, what's the intention behind your observation in something that could be potentially very uncomfortable?
Some of the shadow of like the masculine is like powerlessness. So I think there's an intrinsic defense mechanism that comes up in terms of like even thinking that you're doing something so that you don't feel that sense of powerlessness. And I think that's intrinsic in the nature of conditioning in the collective, is like from a social standpoint, right? Is like we almost demonstrate my love for you by doing something about it. And so I think that's where a lot of like emotional harm is done, because there's somewhat of an implicit like aspect in trying to fix you, which is like the underpinning of rejection and shame, as if like you are the problem itself. So the idea of just being in the sense of presence, right, is actually an expression of love. And I always tell people that like love and compassion, they aren't the right thing to do. They're the most transformative thing to do. When it comes to healing, a lot of healing is a returning and not like a relearning. So that's why it's more important to sort of like be able to receive, whether it's the body or the person's emotional state where it's at, is because it's a processing, and that processing is what creates the transformation.
Do you see the processing in the mind different than the processing in the body?
We tend to cling on to the mind because we're not safe in our own body. And so when we observe sort of the commentary in the mind, we are bringing a sense of presence and attunement and love, along with like observing the sensations of emotions that may be sort of overlaid at that. The body is that as well. The difference is that because it's not esoteric, right, or sort of abstract, like you're having a thought, but we can't necessarily measure your thoughts, right? But it's like everyone thinks, everyone has these sort of frameworks. So not everything you can measure matters, and not everything that matters can be measured. And so this is where direct experience and also like intellectual study are at the intersections of truth. And intellectual studies are often replaced for truth in the same way that like the mind is trying to arrive at truth when it actually is only the conduit of truth from the body, right? So it's the expression of that truth. And so that's part of where we get stuck, is these feedback loops. So like the mind trying to find the truth is just like a misinterpretation. It's a misunderstanding. And in fact, letting go of the mind and coming back to the body is where we experience our truth. And then that is expressed through the mind as a utility, as a conduit. But the way things are currently experienced for the majority of consciousness and reality is that the mind is a replacement for truth. And then we cling on to our identities. And then there's a defense structure. And this is very neurological. So people then defend them as if they're part of them.
When someone loses trust with their body, first of all, what does that mean? And then what are ways that people can rebuild that trust from within?
Yeah, the nature of trust is primarily mediated through the ability to actually recognize that what is being communicated is okay, right? Whether that's uncomfortable sensations by the body. And what I mean by okay is that there's a non-resistance to that, which may be difficult, right? Because our sort of innate response is to move away from uncomfortability. And this is where like spirituality overlaps like human healing. Is like spirituality is like all about the idea of like non-resistance and full acceptance. And acceptance doesn't mean agreement, right? I think people have a difficulty with like understanding the nuanced difference of that. Agreement would be like, oh, I really agree that this is the way the world should be, right? And acceptance is like acknowledging that like resistance is not actually helping that, right? So non-resistance is actually the direct experience of trust, right? Because trust is this concept that we try to convey as like, we all might have this like conceptual idea of what that is. But in the human body, in order to restore that relationship, we actually have to stop looking at the body as the problem, right? That we need to fix, and more or less understand that it's an innate intelligent system that is trying to convey and communicate through many different scales. And I think a large degree of those scales are probably ones that people don't really feel inclined to approach because they're emotional in nature. A lot of what I do in the clinic is emotional integration. And what I mean is that like emotions are really not designed to be like avoided or gotten rid of, but they are designed to be metabolized. And when all emotions have been metabolized, you do arrive at a state of wholeness and liberation. But of course, like this is like a process of sitting with each emotion, not in judgment or in sort of like resistance, but in actual ability to receive it exactly as it is, which is grace. And so trust really is this sort of primary aspect of like letting go of wanting things to be different than what they are. And I always say like everything you want and everything you avoid is in the same place, which is the paradox of the universe. So like, of course, the natural tendency is to say, well, like the body isn't serving what I want it to serve, because a lot of what your wants are is actually in the nature of the mind. And the mind, the dreaming mind, is largely like predicated on things that are unmet in the body. And you can actually complete those unmet needs in the body through the mind. But this is why a lot of spiritual traditions say like you can't get anything outside of yourself, right? To complete yourself. And they were speaking to these same principles, right? And so emotion integration is the ability to metabolize these emotions. And in order to metabolize them, you have to be present with them. And so that's why the body is the conduit and is the primary focus to processing the past, because the body is the only thing that can always be present. The body cannot be anywhere else but present. And so our attention and awareness actually comes back into the body. So I always say like a large degree of healing is actually very simple. It's just not easy. And so like if there was one thing I could recommend everyone do is just spend more of their attention awareness in the body. Because as long as your attention awareness is in the body and not in the dreaming mind, you're actually processing the past and the present, because that's actually the only way you can do that. And a lot of what you do in the clinic is bringing touch and communication back to attention and awareness of the mind to focus back on those areas. And so in many ways, you're helping them process the past and the present. And that is everything to do with healing. And so the ability to trust is largely mediated from our ability to create non-resistance around unpleasant emotions, sensations, and so forth, where we're taught to immediately like, oh my goodness, something massive is wrong, and to panic, which creates a whole cascade within the system, right? Which shifts the entire physiology, which creates a reinforcing loop that, oh, look, it's, wrong. But these are these circular loops, right? That are essentially like vicious cycles that we get caught in. And so this approach of openness and gentleness is what helps us metabolize the past, which is what's impacting the present in terms of our nervous system's experience of reality and ourselves and others. And the word healing comes from the word wholeness. So essentially, in order to arrive back at that experience, we have to be able to reconnect to all aspects of the self, regardless of how unpleasant or uncomfortable they are. And so a lot of healing is moving in the path of most resistance until there's no resistance. And so essentially, that's why these things are a little bit tricky, because I think probably in many ways, some people might understand these things, but then actually doing them is kind of like, oh, going into a cold plunge and maybe knowing the benefits of it at the end, but then knowing that like all that uncomfortability, unpleasantness is not something we're gravitating towards. And that's why most people don't heal, is because we go in the path of least resistance away from our pain, emotional and physical, instead of being presence. Like that is what love is. Love is to stand in presence even when it is uncomfortable and still be there.
What posturing do you see in your practice of people coming in with suppressed emotions? And then how do you take them into that posturing with the work that you do?
Anger is one that is most commonly like suppressed in women and collectively in men as well, but particularly in women, because like the conditioning around like a female is like, you're not supposed to feel that. And you're also supposed to be like very receptive to the nature. That's the nature of the feminine. So it's like the problem is we are both feminine and masculine. Everyone is. But then when you take a role and make it an identity instead of an expression and experience, it becomes contracted. And so anger creates that because it's energy that's directed inward instead of actually expressed. So it's a very potent, volatile energy. And the reason anger is actually a primary mechanism of survival, which is activation of the sympathetic nervous system, is it's trying to mobilize resources for you to do something about it. What the challenge is that people don't actually stay with the anger to metabolize it. They actually act on the anger and create more conditioning in avoidance of the anger, which creates more anger because the anger originated from the place of like, and again, it's a broad scope, so I won't contract it, but a large part of anger is like from boundaries being crossed or unmet emotional needs that you didn't know you had, right? Or unmet resources that were not being met as well. And so this sense of anger is the ability to sort of contract to expand. So you contract inward. That's why a lot of depression is like just anger directed inward, right? And so, but the anger is the body speaking intelligently. And depression is as well. Depression is trying to force you back inward. It's just, again, like there's a miscommunication there, right? And so part of how this approach in the clinic is sort of done is first by listening and hearing and receiving and actually asking the individual a lot about their emotional experience, because underneath that anger is all the emotions that you haven't been able to process, which are actually more challenging to feel than anger. Anger has a unique property to it. It's stimulating and euphoric at the same time. It is like of the shadow. And so like a lot of the way that drives us forward in survival is the ability to stimulate the body to mobilize resources to continue in the direction that we've been going that's kept us alive, paradoxically speaking, actually like what's underneath that is what we need to get back to a state of healing. And actually what we're yearning for and what we feel like isn't quite right, if that makes sense. So by asking people about their emotional state, it gives a sense of interoceptive contemplation about their direct experience. Because most of that is never asked in a physician's office, right? Like, I'm not even sure that they might tell you the labels of like anxiety or depression, but they don't really talk about the emotions themselves. Like, that's not even a conversation. And emotions are largely just an experience, which in order for that experience to shift, paradoxically, is to mediate that through like biochemistry or drugs, is to also just ignore it again. So it's a further betrayal or a further abandonment to what needed to be felt and experienced to be metabolized and integrated, right? Like when you eat food, the food doesn't show up on us. Like we metabolize it and it actually integrates and shows up as part of us in terms of the directions and the sort of constituents that are needed to create us, right? And same thing with emotions. Emotions aren't us, but they feel like us when we're experiencing them because they're so intense. And so, part of like the principles of spirituality is like being able to witness them without engaging with them, giving the person the opportunity to express or at least contemplate and interoceptively express those emotions, and then to actually help them connect to what they don't know, because their mind, unbeknownst to them, like actually is protecting them from connecting the dot, because that's where the pain is. So because this sort of whole process has, I've had direct experience with it, I understand this. And so I sort of like know where their mind is going. And so I take the mind and redirect it in terms of like connecting to the points that they're not connecting to. And that is what helps like emotional integration. And it's completely different than a lot of what psychology teaches, because a lot of the frameworks of psychology is like within the frameworks of the mind, right? Understanding the mind better, which is like playing the game, but like to heal, you have to step out of the game, right? Like you can't actually heal with staying in the game. And that's like the paradox. So I'm trying to connect them back to the nature of their body and how they experience in that moment that led to those compensations, right? And then if they can understand that, then it kind of falls away. It's like, you may have created like certain adaptations or sort of coping mechanisms that are unhealthy, and you probably think it's all because of you, meaning it's like your fault, and you're actually conditioned to believe that because you have all this shame which came from the initial original trauma, and then you have this guilt and this blame and all these unprocessed emotions. And this is why like the nervous system doesn't have the capacity to deal with it when you get sober, because you're now drinking from a fire hose and you can't even handle like a regular hose, right? So like the development of the nervous system, be able to sit with these things to metabolize them. And so the first thing that I do with most patients, usually the second treatment in, is give them a massage through the body buffer that actually helps bring them into a sense of recalibration with the body as they speak through the mind. Because the mind is not the problem inherently, only if it's an identification. The mind is the conduit to further expression and expansion and communication that is a part of healing if it's not mistaken for the truth or an identity. So that helps them start to process and use the mind appropriately to communicate their truth, which is inherently within themselves. And then either partway through the treatment or in separate treatments, I will take them through acupuncture and somatic work to help their nervous system actually process. And these are like small needles are creating massive change, right, between the nervous system at the system-wide level. I very much have the clinic designed to encourage people to come in regularly simply because of that component. But I do whole genome mapping and genetics to help look at the predispositions like methylation, which is actually involved with the nature of emotional processing and largely represented in a lot of the meditation literature, where we see methylation is highly increased and highly enhanced, and why it's called a mental health gene. So if you happen to not have effective methylation, then of course, like everything we do is going to be less effective. So I tried to look at where are your predispositions and how your body is going to compensate, go back there, and then give you what you are not getting and maybe can't get through diet alone, and supply that, and then work on the really important things, which is the nervous system that is what is communicating to all of your genes and your epigenetic expressions and predominantly your experience of yourself, others in the world.
I'm curious your thoughts on integration in the body and release in the body, because I think people use working out as a way to release emotions. What are your thoughts on that? Do you feel like that is a tool for disconnection, or is that a tool for connection if used in the right way?
Yeah, I think it's both, right? So I think the majority of where we're at collectively is sort of the standpoint of control and not connection. So it's like control is the idea is like, I'm going to take my body and, make it this. It's like why every bodybuilding show or like performance or sports is like, it's like, how can I control my body to do this? And actually, again, healing and health come from the word wholeness. Fitness is just one portion of that. And so this idea of control versus connection is one that should be used as a way of understanding, like, how are you interacting with the body in a way that's healthy and sustainable? And the reason I try to give these frameworks is that they're dynamic in nature, right? If I just all of a sudden say exercise is like bad, or even bodybuilding is bad, or figure, I would be inaccurate. It's your relationship to those things. And so if those relationships are ways in which you can connect deeper to your internal experience, then absolutely. It's the same way that like a man and a woman can have a healthy relationship, right? A woman and a woman can have a healthy relationship. It's really to do more with the relationship than it's to do with the thing itself. And so the relationship with exercise, if mediated through control, is largely one that creates a vicious cycle at some point. And addictions are all vicious cycles. They kind of give you what you want, but then like not fully deliver. And over time, they deplete more and more, and you chase it bigger and bigger because the depletion becomes more and more significant. And so most people have a relationship with control when they approach exercise. In fact, it's the very essence of the original usual relationship is like they look in the mirror and they reject through shame. And they're like, what can I do to like go to the exercise so I never see this? Instead of like honoring the nature of the body and connecting to why it might actually be experiencing that relationship based on its prior relationships with their father, their mother, their sort of family, their community, is that maybe you were not mirrored like the healthy behaviors, right? That nourishing your body was necessary with the proper foods, right? And so all of a sudden you're doing the right, you're doing the more healthy thing, but the relationship to it hasn't actually recalibrated. And so like, let's say you achieve a goal within paradigm of like exercise, like losing weight. That's fantastic. But the whole operating system that you're focused on is rejection and shame. And like, basically that your body wasn't enough. And so like, the only way to go further with that operating system is to do even further, right? Which is to not understand the relationship of abuse that you're repeating that was probably done to you, but you have this perception that you're in control now. When really, actually, you're not actually in control. You're just in the perception of control. You're actually repeating the original trauma. And so I experienced this in my own relationship to exercise. And I think that like, there is a lot of exercise used as an escape, right? Of stimulation and euphoria. Everyone has experienced the nature of getting done with exercise. You're like, oh, wow, if I could experience this all the time, it'd be so powerful, right? And so I think that clinging onto that state is largely mediated in terms of not being able to feel the other states. And so I don't think it's a result of a problem within itself, but rather your sort of inability to be present with the other parts of the human experience that you may not want to feel and connect with. And instead, you want to control your experience. And that's where I do believe addiction exercise from just like a systems-wide approach occurs and is a result of, is this sort of like idea that I'm going to control the state at which I'm in. And so if that is the approach, I'm going to control my body and how it looks. And the thing is, none of these things are in the body, they're in the mind. And the mind can actually get you to safety. It can give you an experience of safety momentarily, until like it's not enough, because it was never the truth. The body, though, if you go in that direction, the body will give you the experience of safety in perpetuity if you reconnect with it. So the beauty is that like all the work in that direction is actually sustainable and creates a virtuous cycle, meaning the more you connect with it and the better that relationship, the more energetic the system becomes. Versus the other side, you get more and more burnt out, because that isn't actually energy increasing. It's actually energy mobilizing and stimulating from a system. It's taking energy to use for sort of a vicious contractionary state versus a virtuous expansionary state, which is the reconnection to the body. And so whatever form of exercise you do, it could be spin class, it could be powerlifting, it could be bodybuilding, is how much of your attention and awareness is in the body sensations and experience versus like in the mind dreaming about what if your body looked a certain way, or like, you know, oh, like something that's happening at work, or some sort of aspect of dreaming mind that's dissociating you with the body. The body should be, or exercise should be, the very mechanism to further connection with the body, because exercise creates an aliveness. It allows energy to flow faster, more expansionary, and with a greater level of sensitivity, which is the opposite of death, right? Death is like very dull and like contractionary and like numbness. And so that's why I think exercise is the most potent medicine. It's just our relationship to it is actually equally as important to the exercise itself. And people keep looking for the exercise when they're not looking at the relationship. The relationship is what is important. And so that relationship is about connection, not control.
Okay, so we need to find safety in the body. Oftentimes it lives behind something that's uncomfortable. Do you think people should go digging for these things in their body? Such as, oh my gosh, I know I have trauma in my past, I should really try and like bring it up? Or do you think that it's better to allow it to rise from within, and then that's when you sit with it?
Yeah, I would say that exploring in like a safe place, especially with like a physician or a practitioner that is trained to help you co-regulate and allow you to kind of process, would probably be like step number one, right? And then like step number two would probably be doing a lot of this on your own, which is like doing long sits of meditation. The only reason you do longer sits is because like it gets more uncomfortable the longer you sit. More conditioning from the past is going to come up. And part of the energy ability to sit is going to be tested. So the more that energy is reduced, the less the mind has the ability to avoid what needs to be processed and brought from the unconscious to the conscious. So that's why a lot of like healing traditions use the body as a conduit for emotional and spiritual healing. So they would more or less like reduce the energy supplied to the system. So fasting, long fasting, things like that were done as a way of basically bringing up emotions that would be required with a depletion of the energy that would keep the mind in this really strong contracted state of avoidance. By doing so, this would give way to deeper emotional processing that you might not get to touch, right? So doing longer sits that are focused on the somatic aspect of the body, like body scanning, so sitting or lying down, depending on what feels best for you. Sitting over time is like maybe the next step if you've been lying down, but lying down can be a very powerful way of an entryway, because a lot of people are exhausted. They are using the mind to stimulate. They're not actually operating from any sense of like true energy from the mitochondria and safety, which is how the mitochondria operate. They're like mini nervous systems, and they are like the basis of our evolution. And they have this sort of what we call cell danger response. And they're constantly interacting with our larger nervous system at a larger system-wide approach. And so the safer the body, from the nervous system's perception of reality, the more it turns on the energy output of mitochondria. This is why like there's a vicious cycle and a virtuous cycle. It's like you could see each layer of energy that gets unlocked gives you a greater capacity to process the things of the past. So this is why healing is nonlinear and it's exponential. Is that each point you increase your capacity, more energy turns to the system, and the capacity allows you to process more, right? And meditation isn't to make you a better person. You're already whole the way you are. It's to reconnect to your wholeness and to allow those experiences and expressions to come forward. And so meditation, largely the relationship to it can also be unhealthy. Many people can use meditation as another form of escaping. And so if relationship to meditation is about connecting to the body and actually experiencing whatever sensations are happening, then yeah, you are actually processing the past. But if you're trying to use meditation as a way of like escaping or fixing something that you think is wrong, it's built on an unhealthy relationship, if that makes sense. So one thing with meditation is that it is somewhat of a skill. And I would say it's the skill that people are the furthest away from, because like presence is what feels like the most elusive thing. And all meditation is a practice of presence of what is, and particularly what is happening within the body, because the body is always present. And so when we connect with the body and connect with reality directly, by practicing this, it starts to carry over from an app to an operating system, right? So meditation can be your app in the beginning, but ideally it's to transfer into the operating system, where it is just how you experience reality, which is to be in your body with everything that you do so that you can experience presence as things are unfolding. That's why they say there is no past. There is only the present. Yet we experience the past and the present. And that's why it is so uncomfortable and unpleasant. And meditations, the skill of meditation is largely required through more intensive practice than less intensive. Most people tell you, oh, just practice 5 minutes a day or practice 10 minutes a day. But that's like telling someone like, focus on your business 5 or 10 minutes a day. And then like, 10 years later, they're like, I've been focusing for 5-10 minutes a day. Like, I don't understand why I don't have a business. And it's like, it goes back to this sort of complex systems understanding, right? Most creation is energy intensive up front. Right? If you were to get pregnant, right, the first 9 months is exponentially more energy intensive than every other portion of the path, right? So a misplacement in terms of like the engagement with something is also equally problematic. But I think we communicate the nature of meditation at 5 to 10 minutes because most people say like it's uncomfortable, right? I don't want to just sit there with myself. But like truthfully, people would do a lot better if they did like larger and longer meditation, in terms of the nature of doing 30 minutes, an hour, or 2 hours, or working their way up, right? Rather than like essentially like doing small amounts. And that's because you'll develop that skill within 6 months versus like, if you practice piano for 5 or 10 minutes a day for a year, you might not be that much better. But if you focus an hour every day for the next 6 months, you would be exponentially better.
We love your work. Where can people connect with you, find you? I know you do the NeuBie or the NeuFit, which is super unique. If you want to share a little bit about what that is and then where people can connect with you.
It's one of those sort of technologies that create the safest and yet most impactful change to the broader system and the localized system. And what it does essentially uses DC pulse current, which mimics the same sort of neurological signaling in our own body. So it uses a waveform that is like a sawtooth waveform that is very similar to how our nervous system works. It's not like linear in nature. It's very dynamic. And so this information mimics our own signaling to where like when the NeuBie is on, at first it defends and then it relaxes. And it recognizes the reason the defense even occurs is because they're involving a really high amount of energy into the system and connection to parts that are painful, right? And so that defense naturally happens in the beginning, but then it softens and lessens. The reason it softens and lessens is because it recognizes actually healthy and safe. And that's usually when it breaks through some of that emotional or painful processing in the body and reconnects to itself. We use diagnostically to kind of measure it through scanning the body to see where some of those resistances or defenses are in the body, where the nervous system is holding from things of the past, whether it's emotional or physical, it doesn't really matter. It's the same sort of pattern of resistance and contraction. And so by finding and scanning those areas, we deliver a high amounts of information and energy into the system that the body can actually receive. And it can actually be able to process the past at a much more accelerated rate, which is part of why I use the NeuBie, because like I can't mimic that, right? Even my hands can't give the level of energy information that it provides. And so that intensity of energy actually allows us to make way more progress orthopedically. So roughly thinking from a model, it's about 250 times the strength of communication that we could send. So again, like going back to some of our earlier portion of the conversation where we're talking about like these different aspects of like what levers to pull, depending on like whether we're addressing it at the mind or we're addressing it at the body. It's just like the reason I use the NeuBie predominantly for orthopedic stuff that like is more like pain localized is because that lever is just more impactful than even acupuncture is localized to that. So for emotional processing, actually the NeuBie is effective and helpful for the localized area, but it's less impactful than it is in terms of acupuncture and somatic work and like craniosacral work for like emotional processing. So that's why like it's not that it's not helping, it's just the degree of magnitude. You know, if I showed up to a wildfire with a squirt gun, like I have the right idea, right? Like I have water and puts out fire. I just have the wrong magnitude. And so a lot of the way my clinic is designed is again to pull the highest leverage points of efficacy and safety into one, and to do it from a systems approach, not a singular approach. Not only because I think it's not about being right or wrong. It's just about what's most effective, right? And system-wide approaches are just more aligned with actually our innate system of healing. And so I want to help the body not think it's wrong. And I want to actually help it provide more information to do what it's already doing.
Well, where can people connect with you and find you?
Yes. So social media would be breakthrough performance _rehab. And then my website. And if they're interested in working with me directly, just through the website and booking an appointment.
If you like this episode, share it with a friend. For more conversations filled with awe and wonder, be sure to subscribe to the Vitalist podcasts. Till next time.